Hi, this is Heavy Metal Thunder again. This time I'm going to read This is a short horror story that can stand on its own, but I might rewrite it later to fit in with the superhero storylines I have going on. For right now, these pages are just taking up space, and I might as well post and read them here, and I hope you enjoy it. We had a subscriber submit some artwork for this, so uh, this is going to be with the subscribers' artwork. Hope you enjoy this Heavy Metal Thunder reading of Millennium Bug. Nurse Sanchez looked at the clipboard in her hand with disbelief and sighed as her and Dr. Morrison walked down the hall to see the newly admitted patient to the psychiatric ward. Still flipping through the clipboard and scanning the notes, she asked, "Is this true, Doctor? They actually found her in the middle of the woods in freezing weather, half naked?" Momentarily stopping to give a stern look, he replied, "Yes, and her husband, renowned Dr. Joseph Stein, was found dead in their cabin up there in the dead of winter. In fact, we don't know what exactly happened up there, except for what is written in her personal diary, which I have here. You take it, read it, and get to know the patient. She's in your care now." "But why me? I'm just a nurse. Why did you pick me to take care of her?" Nurse Sanchez asked in confusion. "Why did you pull me from all of my other patients and assign me just to her?" "Dr. Stein used to go to the same high school as I did. We were good friends then. We even went to the same college, but our studies went in different directions. When I heard the news of what had happened, I knew I had to do all I could to help out my old friend. I pulled some major strings and had her transferred here," Dr. Morrison answered. "You are my best nurse. That's why I chose you." "Doctor, I appreciate the compliment, but are you sure we can handle her here?" Nurse Sanchez replied. "Look, I know you're just a nurse, but it will be fine. I'm just wanting you to get close with her. Monitor her conversations with you by either taking notes or using a tape recorder, and make sure she takes the prescribed medications I've assigned her. I'll be doing all the doctor work here. I'll be seeing her for therapy sessions every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 2 p.m. Together, as a team, I hope we can help her and find out what happened to a good friend of mine. Just relax. We'll be working on this together. If anything comes up that you can't handle, call me immediately. Also, the police are still investigating this incident, and will be using all of our records in this investigation as well. So you have to keep in-depth records. Do you understand?" Dr. Morrison said. "Yes, Dr. Morrison, you're right. We can do this together," the now reassured Nurse Sanchez replied. Dr. Morrison handed her the diary, and they continued walking down the hallway until they reached a certain door. "Here she is, nurse. She doesn't remember a thing that had happened up there. It's your duty now to help her. Get to know her and get her to remember what happened up there. I'll be watching your progress and checking in on you from time to time, but this is your show now," the doctor said as he continued walking down the hallway, and Nurse Sanchez alone in front of the door. Nurse Sanchez hardly noticed that Dr. Morrison had left. She had been busy staring inside the room through the locked door's wired mesh window at the poor woman inside. What could have happened to that poor woman up there in the woods all alone? Nurse Sanchez first felt the diary in her hands, and then grudgingly turned her staring eyes at it. She would need time to read through this paperwork before she actually tried to talk to the woman behind the locked door. She made her way back to her office, and as she walked, she began reading the reports on the clipboard again. By the time she was in her office, she had finished reading all of the reports, which basically told her nothing about the patient. She placed the clipboard on the desk, but was still holding on to the diary. But this is, on the other hand, she sat in her office chair behind her desk and flipped on the desk lamp. As she was still looking the cover over, she opened it and read. It said, January 15th, 2015. My husband is going insane, but as his wife, and more importantly, his scientific assistant, I have to support him. He honestly believes an alien computer virus is going to slowly terminate all mankind from the face of the earth. He wants to go somewhere into isolation. It's dead winter, and he wants to go somewhere like deep into the heart of Siberia. I, of course, reminded him of our cabin in Montana, and finally convinced him to move his experiments there. Besides, it would be more cost-effective for the research he is doing. I look forward to being in the fresh Rocky Mountain air. Though it seems to be exciting work ahead, I am still unconvinced of his claims. However, he did try to convince me of his theories. His research in this matter started shortly after New Year's Eve. I believe it was around January 3rd. At first, it didn't seem to matter to him, so a few professors and their families got eradicated. It had nothing to do with him, or so he seemed to think. But even then, I knew it bothered him somewhat that friends he had grown up together with were dying. After the first 50 accounts, though, he began to think he saw a pattern. I find it hard to believe, but it was true, that all the targets were computer specialists like him. I, of course, am not a computer specialist like him, even though I know enough about computers to be a major help to him in his research. He doesn't realize the fact, though, that I learned about computers just to be able to spend quality time with him. He's handsome, makes great money from his work, and is quite the romantic. But I digress from the reason why I am starting this new diary today, which I always start a new diary every time we start a new project together. Anyway, shortly after he came to the hypothesis about it being only computer specialists being targeted, that's when he decided to go to one of the hit sites to confirm his theory. He returned a changed man, shocked by what he had found. Mortified at first. Pardon me. I think by what he had seen. He would not even talk to me about it. For a full day afterwards, he sat alone in his office, not knowing what to do, and it scared me to think about what was running through his mind. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore, and confronted him head-on about it. After some heavy coaxing, he told me that he saw something unlike anything he had ever seen before. He insisted it had to have been a highly advanced computer virus, though I think he was probably sniffing some of the gas that escaped from the pipelines during the fire in the building he went to. He insisted that he had seen it, and that it had spoken to him. He was convinced it was coming for him, and eventually it would be a battle between just him and this highly advanced computer virus. I finally raised his spirits by telling him that I believed him, and perhaps he should try to get a hold of others to see what they thought of his theories. He immediately emailed all the other programmers he knew. However, no one believed him. They sent back emails saying things like, the police reported faulty wiring in the house, or, how could the computer virus do that? It can't. They wouldn't believe him, but somehow he knew, and truly believed it was out there. I truly don't know what to think about all of this, but I do know that tomorrow we leave for our cabin in Montana. Well, it is getting late, and I wrote these few lines only to help clear my head so I can go to sleep. January 17th, 2015. Well, we are finally settled into our cabin in Montana. It took us all day yesterday to settle in and set up our gear and supplies. I am exhausted from all the work, and for a while I thought it would never be over, but it is finally done. Tomorrow Joseph will seriously be starting his research, but for tonight he is resting. Of course was after we had our little bedtime fun. I am wore out, so I am off to bed myself. January 25th, 2015. We have been really busy since we have gotten here. My husband has been doing all the research he can on this virus, such as scanning the news for any clues on how it worked. On his computer, he has calculated the origin of the virus. He came up with these numbers. There was a 1,953,467. Let me repeat that number. 1,953,467,522.008 to 1 odds that the virus was created here on Earth. A 145,563.00345 to 1 odds that a freak accident of some sort created it, and 10 to 1 odds that the origins were alien. Through the news reports, he has developed several safety precautions for our safety. He has us wear rubber gloves and boots, use plastic chairs with no metal parts. We have no electrical appliances that aren't absolutely necessary, and he makes sure there is no metal around the shower or kitchen sink. I think he is going way overboard about this virus thing, but I guess the facts speak for themselves. Have to go. Joseph is hollering for me to come back and help him with his work. February 2nd, 2015. I am dead tired, but have had a little sleep here and there. Joseph is now sleeping and wants me to awaken him in a couple of hours, so just stay to wait. I am writing in my diary. He has been working day and night, with very little sleep, on his highly advanced virus eradicator. When he does get a little sleep, his dreams are nightmares about the virus killing him. He has told me a couple of his nightmares. In one of his nightmares, he realizes he is aboard an alien spacecraft, the same alien spacecraft he believes that has sent the virus to Earth. Of course, he could not make out the alien shapes very clearly because it was too dark aboard the alien spacecraft. Lights from nearby computers with flashing buttons surrounded the room. The aliens were speaking in an unknown language, unlike any he had ever heard before. Even though he couldn't understand a word that they were saying, he quickly realized what they were doing. They were releasing the virus on the poor, unsuspecting Earth. They pressed a few buttons and then celebrated by jumping up and down excitedly and shouting vigorously to one another as a stream of energy shot out other ship and hit a nearby satellite. Apparently, they didn't even realize he was there as he screamed, "No!" Another type of nightmare he has is when he thinks he is actually awake, but is still dreaming. He will be working in his lab on his computer. He will go to get something from a drawer in his desk, and when he opens it, there will be the virus. It shoots out of the drawer and impales him through the heart with a metal-like tail. Usually after one of these nightmares, he will scream in horror and wake himself up, like he just did now. I have to go. February 15th, 2015. Well, so much for love being in the air and for Valentine's Day. Joseph hasn't even acknowledged the holiday. With everything we've been through lately, I dare not bring it up. He is constantly scrolling through the latest news, and every time Joseph notices another family has been killed under the strange circumstances. As luck would have it, as soon as he sees the last name, he immediately realizes it was a fellow colleague of his, another professor. So far, there have been 301 incidents that we know of. Many of the people who didn't believe him are now dead, but he insists he will not be taken, at least not without a fight. He's still not exactly sure what it is, but now he insists that it's only a matter of time before it comes after him. Now, most of the time, Dr. Joseph Stein spends most of his time in deep isolation, even from me, working on this advanced form of computer virus detection and destruction system. I am frustrated and angry with Dr. Joseph Stein. I can't believe he just totally forgot about Valentine's Day and hardly speaks to me anymore. That's why I'm calling him by his full name. Whoa, what's this? I actually think he's calling for me. Maybe he's finally finished this stupid project of his and we can go home. Well, I guess I'll go and see what he wants. I might even give him a piece of my mind as well." Nurse Sanchez skimmed through the rest of the blank pages in the diary, but there was nothing else written in it. She then looked through the report to check the date they had found her, and brought her in. It was February 19th, 2015. Reviewing the facts in her mind, she came to her own conclusion that the whole incident was a result from a fight between the two of them. Nothing is more bitter than love scorned. As for the good Dr. Joseph Stein, she even said he was going mad. Instead of taking him to the woods, they should have both came here for help in the first place. She thought about the news she had been watching recently, and as far as she could remember, there was nothing about families being killed off that she knew about. She thought for a few moments about how she should handle this case. First things first, the proper medication must be administered. Then, and only then, would she attempt to talk to Mrs. Stein. It would take time, but she would eventually be able to straighten out Mrs. Stein's mind, and Dr. Morrison and her could convince Mrs. Stein how crazy she had been, hopefully. It has been several days since Mrs. Stein has been admitted. Miss Stein hadn't been much of a problem, as Dr. Morrison had suspected that she might be, and returned Nurse Sanchez to taking care of her other patients as well. It seems as though the medication has been doing its job quite well, and that Mrs. Stein was coming along quite nicely. Nurse Sanchez had been keeping track of her progress, and was quite pleased with how she was coming along. In fact, Dr. Morrison had complimented her on her work with Mrs. Stein, along with the work on some of her other patients as well, though there were a few problems with a couple of the other patients. For instance, Mr. Wilbanks tried to escape, and almost succeeded, and Mrs. Edens somehow had gotten a hold of a real butter knife and attempted for the third time since she had been here to commit suicide by slicing her wrist open with it. Other than these two incidents, though, most of her patients were coming along quite well. Nurse Sanchez thought about these things as she walked down the hallway with a tape recorder, pen, clipboard, and notebook already in hand for her therapy session with Mrs. Stein. Nurse Sanchez looked forward to the session with Mrs. Stein today because there was a promise of coming to a major breakthrough today. Hopefully, Nurse Sanchez could finally get Mrs. Stein to open up about what had actually happened up there in the woods, and finally give Dr. Morrison something to help in his therapy sessions with her. Nurse Sanchez met the guard at the door to Mrs. Stein's room, and the guard let her in, locking the door behind her. Nurse Sanchez knew all too well that it was common procedure for the guard to wait just outside the door for her to finish, just in case of trouble, but she really didn't expect any trouble from this poor woman. The rooms were quite small in the mental ward. Each room contained a small twin-sized bed pushed against the right side wall, a small two-drawer dresser at the foot of the bed, two chairs, and a table pushed by the wall close to the door, and hidden behind a small wall was a toilet and a sink combination that thing made of metal and connected to the wall. Of course, the showers weren't in the rooms. They were down the hall, so patients could be watched and kept from suicide attempts. These were how the rooms for the less violent and non-suicidal patients were set up anyway. The more violent ones only had a bed and metal toilet sink contraption in the open, so they could be constantly watched. Mrs. Stein hadn't shown any violent signs, and was willingly working with the staff cooperatively so far. Miss Stein had been expecting her to come, and was already sitting down in the other chair farthest from the door. Nurse Sanchez sat down in the other chair and set up her things for the interview. With the drug-induced stupor still in effect on her, and her legs shaking, Mrs. Stein replied rather slurred, "Hi, Nurse Sanchez. I've been expecting you to come. I think I can remember some of the things that happened. but I really don't want to. Why don't you want to remember? By remembering and telling me, I can help you to get control of your life back. You want that, don't you? Nurse Sanchez coaxed. Yes, but the memories are so frightening. I don't know if I can overcome them, Miss Stein said with a touch of nervousness in her voice. Come now, I'm here with you. I'll help you through it. Just think back and tell me about what you see. I won't let anything happen to you, I promise, coaxed Nurse Sanchez. Well, all right, Miss Stein said, though she was still quite reluctant to do so. I remember that Joseph, that's my husband, Dr. Joseph Stein, had fallen asleep in front of his computer. Meanwhile, I was sitting in the living room watching him sleep, while listening to some music that was playing on the radio. I had been sitting there drinking a Coke and debating whether or not I should go on to bed or continue doing the exhausting work I had been doing. As was normal since we had gotten to the cabin, my husband woke himself up screaming from one of his nightmares, to find himself still sitting in front of his computer screen, which had also fallen asleep. He awakened the computer to check out what time it was, and I remember him saying that it was around 1 in the morning, and that the last time he remembered looking at the time was around 11 last night. That's when he decided to get something to drink from the refrigerator to combat the dry mouth he had. He began to walking into the kitchen, but as he was going in, he must have heard movement or something and quickly stepped back. An electric arc of sparks shot several knives across the room. To our amazement and surprise, the knives stuck into the door with loud thumps, where he had been standing just seconds before. I couldn't believe it, but it was there. I stood up and was about to run over to him, but he motioned for me to stay put, so I just stood there. He ran over to his computer and immediately ran the virus detection program. We both could see the occasional electric sparks flying from the keyboard, but he had been prepared for that with the rubber gloves. From where I was standing, I could see the computer screen as it flashed. Virus detected. Initiating capture sequence. At the same time, electrical sparks began to fly out of the plug-ins in the room. The spectacle lasted for about a minute. Before the virus, I would guess, decided to remove the electricity completely from the room in order to stop the program. The lights started to go out, but it only lasted a second before the program had caught it. The computer screen flashed. Virus captured. Initiating eradication process. A couple of seconds passed, and then it was replaced by another sentence on the screen. No, don't do this. I beg you, Dr. Stein. You win. You are smarter than me. 011011101110101 skits others. The computer screen then flashed as if in a triumphant glory. Virus eradicated. I did it, Joseph shouted as loud as he could as he jumped up and down just like a kid in celebration. I defeated the virus. Something in the back of my mind must have heard the electric buzz from nearby, but Joseph was too excited to care. I watched, still in disbelief, at what I just saw, and before I could warn him, he removed his rubber gloves. He was yelling, though I couldn't make it out clearly. Stuff like that this called for commemoration, and tomorrow they would both return to society, but tonight he could go to bed and rest peacefully. I watched, frozen in horror, as he went to the refrigerator to get something to drink. He had to have heard the buzzing, for it was so loud, but it just didn't register in his brain what exactly it was. As he grabbed the handle of the door, still yelling about his victory plans, what must have been 1,000 bolts of electricity shot through him and flung him across the room. As he lay there on the floor, either already dead or dying, I could see the computer screen flashing. Virus detected. Initiating capture sequence. I could not move, no matter how hard I tried. I simply stood there, frozen in fear, just like an icicle. Wire tentacles finally snapped me out of my daze as they began to wrap tightly around me. But then the permanent darkness came as the power went off. Still captured though by the tentacles, I ripped myself free, tearing my clothes to shreds, and ran for the outside. Fear that the power would return along with the virus drove me to keep running and not stop for anything. Okay, Mrs. Stein, you're making really good progress. That's enough of a session for today. At least you're willing to talk about the fact that something did happen to your husband. Maybe tomorrow we can tell me the truth and begin your road to recovery, Nurse Sanchez said, as she began to gather up her stuff and prepared to leave. But you read my diary, shouted Mrs. Stein as she grabbed a hold of Nurse Sanchez's arm. You have to believe me. I'm telling you the truth. We'll talk about it tomorrow, Mrs. Stein, Nurse Sanchez said nervously. This was the last thing she expected to happen from this poor woman. Frantic now, she screamed out, Guard! The guard rushed in, pushing Miss Stein back far enough to get himself and Nurse Sanchez out of the room and locked the door. Nurse Sanchez gathered her frazzled nerves together and straightened herself up. She thanked the guard and began walking down the hallway. Miss Stein, however, wasn't finished ranting and raving. She came to the door's window and began hollering, I'm protected from the virus in here, you know. There are no plug-ins in here, and the light bulb is sealed. You, on the other hand, the virus can get you. Nurse Sanchez could no longer make out what she was saying anymore as she went around the corner, though she could still hear her yelling. She knew the guard would let Miss Stein wear herself out as long as she didn't try to get out of her room. Nurse Sanchez decided that she would have to call Dr. Morrison here shortly, but first she would file her report. It wasn't as good of a breakthrough as she had hoped for, but there was some progress, and a little digression as well. But that wasn't anything that a raising of the medication dosage wouldn't cure. That poor woman. Nurse Sanchez reached her office, sat down at her desk, and prepared to type a report of Miss Stein's progress on the computer. Before doing anything at all to the computer, however, the lights in her office began to flicker on and off slightly. Nurse Sanchez's heart fluttered slightly faster for a second. For a millisecond, it seemed that she could recall all of the horrible storms that she had lived through in her childhood, like the horrible tornado that had wiped out part of the town she had grew up in, and her parents holding her tight in the safety of their storm shelter. The flickering of the lights stopped, and her heartbeat returned to normal. She suddenly griped at herself for her momentary weakness, telling herself, You're just a little on edge because you weren't expecting Mrs. Stein to get that excited. Nurse Sanchez returned back to the computer to start her report and clicked on the mouse to bring up the password screen. She typed in her password and pressed the enter key. When she removed the screensaver, however, instead of going into her report program, to her surprise appeared the words, Got you. The words appeared on her screen, covering up the whole monitor with huge letters. Cord technical shot up from out of nowhere. The virus had come to get Nurse Sanchez. Hope you enjoyed this story. Tune in next time. Heavy Metal Thunder signing out.